The atomic genie weighs in his hands the powers of both creation and destruction. As yet, the world has reason to fear those destructive powers. So our last wish should simply be for the atomic genie to remain forever our friend. We have inherited a wealth of knowledge from the great thinkers of the past. That this heritage would ever be applied towards destruction was farthest from their minds and hearts. It lies in our own hands to make wise use of the atomic treasures. Then the magic touch of the genie will spread throughout the world, and he will grant the gifts of science to all mankind. The great scientists before us gave us knowledge of the atom, and our last wish will come true if we use the power of this knowledge in their spirit. Then the atom will become truly our friend.
So this week I was pretty darn excited, actually, to find this piece of Disney history, piece of the Disneyland show from 1957, which honestly I'm pretty surprised that I never saw before. Perhaps I had, but if I had, I've totally forgot about it. And so I came across this episode from 1957. For those of you who don't know, Disneyland there was a show. It eventually became The Magical World of Disney and The Wonderful World. They had it changed titles 10 times over the years, but the original version was called Disneyland. And many of us are familiar with the famous episodes featuring Wernher von Braun talking about space travel, and there's the famous one about mathemagics with Donald Duck and the pentagram and all that.
Well, I'll be a persuaded fan.
It was our old friend Pythagoras who discovered that the pentagram was full of mathemagic.
So we're familiar with a lot of these clips. So that's why it was kind of interesting to find this one called Our Friend the Atom, featuring the narration of another Operation Paperclip reformed Nazi, Disney Nazi, Heinz Haber, who turns out is almost as interesting a character as von Braun himself. He was a consultant on a number of the Disney space episodes with von Braun, and also provided the story for Donald in Mathmagicland, which I just mentioned. But this one called Our Friend the Atom, which had a companion book that was produced. It's just so interesting. It's amazing how when you go and you watch all these, one of the things that is so fascinating is you see how the whole Disney corporation really, during World War II and then afterward, it was always basically a propaganda factory. And this one specifically on the heels of Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace campaign, where it was about promoting the idea of atomic energy for peaceful applications. But what I think is so great about this is that it really kind of gives you, if you're kind of brand new to the idea of questioning physics and the sort of grander scientific paradigm through the lens of biblical cosmology, which of course affects not only the conception of space and the heavens and the luminaries and all that, but it really, the bulk of it, I would say, really applies to the question of physics and atomic theory being a huge, huge part of that, potentially even more important than the outer space stuff. But it gets way less attention. And so, yeah, this kind of made me harken back again to sort of the early years of my channel where I would have been geeking out if I'd seen this for so many reasons. And I'll play a few clips from it. But it's a good kind of overview of basically the history of how this paradigm of atomism, first introduced in ancient Greece by Democritus, but then resurrected later again through, guys like Rutherford and Dalton, and then ultimately the one everybody knows, the uber famous Albert Einstein and his theory of relativity.
Albert Einstein discovered a lot more than the bad hair day.
Say this, buddy. His work was the foundation for what you call your modern scientific thought.
But here's what I found really amazing about this Disneyland episode is that they used the story of the fisherman and the genie as like their allegory for the discovery of atomic energy, which is just wow. So yeah, the fisherman finds the lamp and he pops it open, and then the genie comes out and threatens to kill him, and he's all terrified because he's unleashed this horrific force upon himself. But then he tricks the genie into going back into the bottle, and then he makes the genie promise to give him wishes to let him out again. So the genie, he becomes the genie's master. I mean, just by itself, that's kind of an amazing cartoonified illustration of how people who use witchcraft really view magic. Like this harkens all the way back to like Solomon and his, rings of power and all that. The jinn that would obey his command by the seal of Solomon. And this essentially is the lie of witchcraft, right? Because ultimately the power that is behind your spells, the power that is behind your manifestations, your wishes, your rituals, whatever the methodology, the spiritual energy behind it is coming from demons. But of course, the illusion, the deception is that they're under your control, when in reality, you're the one who's enslaved to them. So what an amazing allegory to use for this quote-unquote scientific discovery of atomic theory and atomic power, and also how it sort of encapsulates the twofold nature of this deception, where he says, the genie holds the power of destruction and creation.
We found a vessel. And like the one in the fable, it contains a genie. A genie hidden in the atoms of this metal, uranium. The atomic genie weighs in his hands the powers of both creation and destruction.
The terrible prospect of massive destruction through the nuclear bomb, but also the promise of basically a whole new civilization. I mean, it's just fascinating to me every time I kind of stop and go back and think about all this propaganda that was going on in the 50s and the post-war period, where, it was simultaneously being used to terrify everyone and, crawl under the desk, fallout shelters and all this. It was totally fear porn. It was the COVID-19 of its day, and continued to be sort of the major narrative that drove the entirety of the Cold War, the threat of nuclear, destruction, mutual destruction. But then at the same time, especially in the 50s, it was promising all these miraculous societal benefits. And this is another thing I love about this piece, is that it kind of shows you not only the nuclear submarines and nuclear, powered battleships and stuff, which we have, but then, of course, nuclear-powered planes and nuclear-powered rockets, and we were going to have all these medical applications of nuclear energy, and it was going to help us grow plants and understand how to create more food and farm animals and all kinds of stuff that now seem a little insane. Oh yeah, and of course fighting cancer too. That is something that I think more and more people are realizing, that sure, you can do it, but it's also, there's layers of deception in all this stuff. And so the destruction part, The lie in terms of creating a narrative that will serve as a pretext for military action and military spending and all that barely needs elaboration at this point, particularly in our present moment in time with the Middle East and Iran.
They have the wherewithal, the stored up, preserved knowledge to make a bomb very quickly if they wanted to do it.
Iran is so dangerous. Weeks away from having the fissile material for an entire arsenal of nuclear bombs.
They're very close. They're 6 months away from being about 90% of having the enriched uranium for an atom bomb. Iran is gearing up to produce 25 bombs, atomic bombs a year, 250 bombs in a decade. Ladies and gentlemen, time is running out.
Iran will be capable of producing alone, without importing anything, nuclear bombs within 3 to 5 years.
You know, we've all seen these compilations of Netanyahu talking about Iran being weeks away from a nuclear weapon for decades now.
If not stopped, Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time. It could be a year, it could be within a few months.
So that has not gone away. That's what's kind of amazing, is that here we are, almost a century later, from the first alleged use of an atomic weapon, and they're getting a lot of mileage out of that. So that's no small thing. That is no small psyop. The threat of nuclear destruction, and it kind of receded a bit when I was growing up in the 80s. I think the most impactful piece of propaganda that we experienced growing up related to the nuclear threat was Terminator 2, right? The beginning of Terminator 2. So it was a movie, but I mean, that was seared into my brain as a young person when I saw that. But now, and here's the part that I kind of want to expound upon, the Genie side, this atomic Genie, particularly now too, where just the irony that with so many people, quote unquote, noticing, and so many people just openly talking about Israel and Zionism and Kabbalah too, being discussed way more openly than it was even 10 years ago. It's kind of hard to believe it's been so long, but yeah, I was talking about this a lot prior to COVID and in the early days of my own kind of coming into the topic of cosmology and scientism. And so, I mean, there's so many people now who weren't even saved 5 years ago or have just come into these topics rather recently. I mean, to me, COVID still feels like it was yesterday. It's crazy that it's like 5-6 years ago. People tell me, oh, I got saved in like 2022 or 2020. And I'm like, that was yesterday, like I can't believe that was already years ago. So hopefully an example of propaganda like this will help connect the dots and help you see that like without Copernicanism, really, the whole atomic theory and then by extension quantum theory and all the other, as physics got more and more into the mystical realm, this was kind of a huge transition point, was Einstein and the age of the atom and this whole belief in E equals mc squared.
Look, our new element. How radiant it is. It even glows in the dark. We should call it radium.
Radium turned out to be a mysterious source of energy. This remarkable element would go on radiating like an endlessly flowing spring. This was against all laws of science known at that time. How could this tiny mass contain so much energy? This mystery shook the very foundations of science. It was finally understood in 1905 when Albert Einstein discovered an important new law. His theory showed that every mass contains a tremendous amount of energy.
E stands for energy, M for mass. And c squared is the speed of light multiplied by itself. Now, c squared is a very great number. And so, if multiplied by even a small mass, the result will be a very great amount of energy.
This is a cold scientific explanation, but its deep meaning can be easily understood through our fable. Einstein, like the fisherman, found that a mighty force was contained in a small vessel. Radium constantly releases tiny bits of its energy through radiation, a little bit every second. And there is so much energy that this activity can go on for thousands of years. These rays were actually tiny fragments of atoms breaking apart. No longer could the atom be considered the smallest particle in nature. Evidently, the atom was not an indestructible little ball after all. But then, what was it? The first clue to this question came from Lord Ernest Rutherford of England. The year was 1911.
Today, I used the fast-flying fragments of radium as tools to probe into the atom. I placed a small sample of radium inside a solid lead block. The lead absorbed all the rays except those that were allowed to escape through a small opening in the block. One might say it was a sort of atomic gun. To make the ray bullets visible, I used a fluorescent screen. For a target, I chose a very thin leaf of gold. But to my surprise, the bullets from my atomic gun passed right through the gold leaf as though it wasn't there. It was like shooting at a ghost. This was truly amazing because the gold leaf was a solid wall, 2,000 atoms thick. So the atom can't be as solid as we always thought. Then, unexpectedly, one out of thousands of bullets ricocheted, striking something solid. I can only conclude, then, the atom is mostly empty space, like a cloud or shell. But occasionally I hit something solid. It must be very small, a tiny particle in the center. I shall call it the nucleus of the atom.
With Rutherford's discovery of the nucleus, scientists began to understand how nature builds her atoms. The shell of the atom appears solid, just as a fast-whirling fan seems solid. Actually, the shell is composed of a whirling swarm of tiny electrical particles called electrons. They circle around the nucleus like planets around the sun. So the atom is like a tiny solar system. But scientists are ever curious. Like the fisherman who examined the vessel he had hauled ashore, they began to probe the atomic nucleus for its secrets. They found that it was composed of small particles electrically charged. They called them protons, which means primary particles. Later, to the great surprise of science, other strange particles were discovered in the nucleus. They had no electrical charge. They were neutral. And so they were called neutrons. At last, the mystery of the atom structure was solved. How amazing nature is. Think of it. There are countless solar systems of atomic suns and planets in everything. There's a whole universe in the tip of a pencil.
So central to all of this, we can see, because he uses this description in the 50s, that basically the atom is like a little mini solar system. And if you stop and think about that, like how crucial it was to first get people to totally embrace the concept of bodies orbiting other bodies, which is really, you know, for those of you who've kind of deprogrammed from all that, like looking back on it, you see how absurd it is. The fact that things just like, oh, moons orbit around planets and planets orbit around the sun like they're attached to some sort of string or a tether. And that's how gravity works, right? And they don't slow down and they go in parabolic arcs and they go, you know, gravitational orbits are just kind of a mind-numbing, silly doctrine for people to absorb. And yet that was super duper important, not just to believe in outer space, but just the concept of bodies orbiting other bodies. When you kind of stop and look at all of it, you realize that, yeah, without that piece, if you had just presented the idea of an atom, this model of an atom, with like the nucleus and then the electrons orbiting around it, that would have just seemed like insanity. Like nobody would look at that picture and be like, yeah, that makes sense. Everything is really mostly empty space. And that's really where I feel like the kind of 2 + 2 = 5 programming of atomic theory can be most like easily identified. And we've all heard this, right? Where it's like, well, this desk I'm sitting at seems solid, but it's really mostly empty space, or like all of matter is mostly empty space. This is kind of one of the maxims of quote unquote science, all of which now I look at as being just completely obvious examples of how all this stuff is basically just ancient mysticism, and particularly things from Kabbalah, which talk about all of creation being a constant projection of energy from the source that's being filtered down through these like layers, like lenses, filtering out certain parts of the light to the lower each level. It's like a waterfall. It's like a cascading series of lenses or filters, dimensional filters, right? But everything is energy, according to Kabbalah. Everything is energy. Everything is light. And once you kind of understand that's the core teaching of these ancient mystery schools, that matter is an illusion. Then you look at what physics has taught for the past century or two, and the progression from ancient Greece, and then down through the alchemists of Europe, who then became all the Royal Society guys, and then kind of started reintroducing these concepts, and then proving it by, shooting a neutron gun through gold. And then we go, oh,
atom. That's from a Greek word that means uncuttable.
But this is the part that I find most interesting and ironic, is that while so many people are outwardly turning on Zionism and the nation-state of Israel, but in terms of Kabbalism, it's amazing how we can see this massive uptick in people embracing the concepts of Hermeticism and alchemy and, you know, the Noetic sciences, whatever. There's a million different ways to describe these spiritual doctrines that are all present in the system of Kabbalah. But on a mass propaganda scale that everyone learned in school, and everyone learned about Einstein and the E = mc², literally teaches that all mass is essentially reducible to energy at the end of the day, that everything is energy. This icon of the atom essentially represents this entire belief system. I mean, it's a pretty phenomenal thought. It still kind of amazes me that in the age of science, here we have this guy using the analogy of magic, the analogy of a genie, to describe the discovery of atomic energy, which, okay, once you kind of walk it back through and realize that a big part of quote-unquote proving the globe was the elimination of the idea of an ether. I mean, it's such a sort of double-minded thing where it's like, okay, everything's energy, mass is all energy, but at the same time, energy is essentially mass. Like, everything is a particle. And so they use these words, but they kind of devoid them of all their, like, obvious and everyday meaning. And that's, of course, how wizardry, sophistry, magic, you know, that's how Satan works, right? Is by inverting the definitions of things. He's the liar and the father of all lies. And so it makes perfect sense, but again, it comes down to that whole thing of being able to wrap our heads around the idea that the world could be that deceived. Because it's science, you know. It's the proverbial backdoor to everything. It's just to introduce it in terms of science and have some cockamamie explanation. So really we can see that, cosmology has all kinds of implications. And the whole question of, well, why would they lie about the shape of the Earth has to do with so much more than just the shape of the Earth. It has to do with the shape of just reality itself, or the nature of reality itself, to where now, an educated person will totally nod their head and be like, oh yeah, this concrete wall is mostly empty space. The average educated person believes that essentially everything is a sort of projection. And that's what's interesting too, is that, because now they'll say, well, an atom really isn't like a solar system. That's like a kind of crude analogy, even though, they were making it in the 50s very directly, obviously. And that's what we still all see. But in reality, it's a probability sphere. It's a probability cloud around the nucleus. And so, imagine trying to kind of convince people right out of the gate that everything is made of these things called atoms, and atoms aren't really things, they're just probability clouds, and they have these little components of protons and neutrons, and all of this would be impossible to get the public to buy into if you didn't first have the idea of planets orbiting the sun, and, without Copernicanism, there's no Einstein. And so, like I said, there's multiple layers of deception going on, one being more of an occultation of the true nature of electromagnetism, which becomes a lot less esoteric once you reintroduce the idea of there being some kind of medium, that these are not particles that are just pinging around. As Kenneth Wheeler always says, at the end of the day, as a photographer, I don't open up my camera and pour all the photons out. Right? That makes it sound so silly and absurd, because it is absurd. The idea that these are little particles, they would have to accumulate somewhere. They would have to amass. And that's essentially what they say, that, most of this whole idea of that we are star stuff, they say that because the sun and all the stars being suns and the sun being a star, according to modern astronomy, according to science, that these are giant nuclear furnaces. It's all intrinsic to evolution. Without atomic theory, without the solar alchemy, you don't have evolution. It is a linchpin piece of their narrative to have atomic fusion, right? Because that's how, after the Big Bang, the stars became these nuclear furnaces that then churned out all the different elements that are then shot out from the center of the sun and then accumulate on these bodies that are floating around and then eventually orbiting all the stars. And that's how we have gold and oxygen and hydrogen and all the building blocks of eventually life on Earth, right? But all that stuff radiated out of these nuclear furnaces and sort of creating the Lego pieces that the entire universe is constructed out of, if you want to think of it that way. So from a Darwinian Big Bang perspective, you can see how crucial this is to their whole paradigm. So you're hiding the true nature of electromagnetism, which is perturbations in a medium. So you don't have this whole paradox of particle-wave duality, like how is light a particle but also a wave? Because a wave, in any other context, a wave has to be waving through something. It's a wave in water, there's, wind in the air, there's whatever, there's a medium. And so we live in this world now where we're surrounded by electromagnetic waves of all these different frequencies, all pulsing through the air all around us all the time, through the walls. But we've been taught that there are these little particles that are just shooting out of stuff. And it's really absurd when you stop and think about it. But of course, that is intrinsic to this entire paradigm of science, specifically, after Einstein, where the idea of some kind of an ether, some kind of a medium that is almost sort of a paradimensional fluid, if you will. That's why radio waves can go through matter in some ways, because there is this ether that almost permeates or is on top of the solid physical matter. It is almost kind of like going back to a more of the primitive elemental conceptions of the world. But it's interesting that, all the pagan societies were the ones who were obsessed with all this stuff and, the Platonic solids and trying to understand, what is the nature of creation. When we open up the Bible, we don't see God really too preoccupied with helping us understand the granular mechanics of his creation. Because we can know the creator himself, who understands all the physics and the metaphysics, and he decides, what we really need to know. And so that's, of course, the major distinction. Is there a personal God outside of all this? Is there a being who is the one holding it all together and who created it all out of nothing, who has ultimate authority over all the laws of physics, or is he bound by them? So the Kabbalistic, aka Masonic, once we understand that Freemasonry is really just a vessel for this Kabbalistic philosophy, which is its religion, but also has all these obsessions with metaphysics and, building. The whole allegory of building really applies. The architect and building and structure. This is all about the structure of reality. And that's sort of all the esoteric stuff that it's claiming to understand all the secrets of. But these are the guys, right? It's the Freemasonic, Rosicrucian, Royal Society guys, the alchemists who took these theories and funded them and put them in the textbooks and taught the world to fear the mushroom cloud. I mean, isn't it amazing how even in this cartoon they show the mushroom cloud, they overlay it with the animation of the genie. Like, just watching that alone was like, dude, that is some... Talk about lying signs and wonders, you guys. Think about this from like a stage magic. This is serious like social alchemy right here, where it's like you show the public all these film reels and all these images of the mushroom cloud going off with all their testing and people seeing this. Yeah, it really is suggestive of like this foreboding specter of doom, like this, like a monster rising out of the earth. The beast rising out of the pit. Like, they're kind of showing you how the magic was done, right? Like, oh, the genie's out of the bottle. Oh no, what have we unleashed upon the world? I have become death, the destroyer of worlds, the Oppenheimer quote. Isn't it amazing that Oppenheimer movie came out right before we kicked off all this stuff with Iran? Very coincidental timing, right? But all of this, to me, this is all a part of how Mystery Babylon, seduced the world, where we read about all the nations have drunk of the wine of her adulteries. All the nations have fornicated with her. Because we were all taught this stuff. We've all bought into these, essentially what are Jewish fables. That's basically what all of Kabbalah is. As mentioned in Titus 1. And it's amazing, you guys. Another thing I've been digging into recently that it's going to have to be its own video is the whole concept of the millennium and how that is talked about quite explicitly in the Zohar and even predates the Zohar. It goes way back into Jewish mysticism. It's Talmudic eschatology. Everything about the Nephilim and the whole idea that the Nephilim were the offspring of angels mating with humans, that's all in the Zohar. That's all in Kabbalah. All this, the serpent seed doctrine, it comes from Kabbalah. Like so much stuff that is just taking the Christian conspiracy world by storm and has for a long time. I mean, Tucker Carlson just put out a whole interview with some guy about, the Nephilim. This is all Jewish fables. So we're going to have to talk about that soon. The millennial reign. So whether you're in the camp of the post-millennial camp, Satan's little season, all that stuff, you're just regurgitating Jewish fables. Dispensationalism, Christian Zionism, of course, is, not surprisingly, it's the same thing. This concept of the cosmic week, there's 6,000 years of creation and the 7th millennial messianic age, that is straight out of Kabbalah. That is in the Zohar. So I'm still kind of compiling my notes on that, but I wanted to talk about the atomic genie, particularly in terms of everything going on with Iran, but also so many people now, because of things like the Artemis missions, and I think just seeing, now that it's like, okay, we have AI that can literally create video footage of anything. So many people are kind of waking up to the outer space thing in NASA and seeing how it just doesn't make any sense. Like, we're going to go put robots on the moon and build a moon base, but, what's the point? We're going to start mining for, what was it they were saying? They're going to start mining helium-3 or something on the moon. People are seeing through that stuff, I think, more and more. But the cosmology issue, like the whole faking space and the solar system part, it's just like, it's kind of just scratching the surface, really. It actually goes way, way deeper into, like I said, the matter of physics turning into metaphysics. The very concept of the whole world being a projection, aka simulation theory, goes back to stuff like Einstein and accepting the idea that all physical matter is just energy. Like, from a biblical perspective, if we are honest and we go back to Genesis, where it said, the first thing that God creates is light. He separates the light from the darkness. He says that it's good. And light exists before you even have light sources like the sun, moon, and stars, which I've always found fascinating. Even as a young child, I was like, that's amazing. There was day and night before you even had the sun and the moon. But in the Bible, we see a very distinct difference between earthly bodies and heavenly bodies, right? Like, that's what 1 Corinthians 15 is all about. The perishable cannot inherit the imperishable. Whereas E equals MC squared is essentially a philosophical or a metaphysical doctrine encapsulated in the form of an equation. But really, it's just teaching that everything is energy, everything's the same. Everything's one. Everything's ultimately the same substance when you really, really get down to it. And that's what we all learned in school. Think about how crazy that is. From the perspective of spiritual indoctrination. This is the false religion that we were all taught. And I think that was kind of the crazy, mind-blowing realization as I started to really look into these matters and think about everything that we were taught in school being part of this false Babylonian religion without recognizing it as a religion. It's just, oh, this is what we know. This is what humanity has discovered. This is what all these great men of science throughout the ages have uncovered, and it all just happened naturally. But then we'll turn around and allegorically talk about genies and magic. Which is like always the case. Like, why is Isaac Newton, the guy who's like the most famous scientist in all of history, why was he obsessed with the occult? Why was he all into alchemy? And Kabbalah, and a Freemason and all this stuff. Dude, I didn't even know that there was, like, the Apollo Lodge. Did you know that there's an Apollo Lodge at Oxford? Do you guys ever watch this S. Williamson channel? I went off on a total rabbit trail last night. I was watching this. I gotta go finish this video. He's this guy in England, and he just, like, kind of walks around London and different places and takes video and does commentary. And every time I watch it, I learn something kind of random. And this one, he's at Oxford, and he mentioned the Apollo Lodge. And then there's an Isaac Newton Lodge at Cambridge. That's like the sister lodge. And all these famous people went to these. And then I ended up reading about Oscar Wilde and all that, and how he went to one of these for a while, but then supposedly walked away from Freemasonry. But this is so deep. If you understand that Freemasonry, this is why it makes sense that all the NASA astronauts were Freemasons and all this Masonic stuff at NASA, why it's all teaching you Kabbalistic doctrine at the end of the day, is because that's what Freemasonry is. And when we talk about the founding of America, being all these, Masonic guys pretending to be Christians and pretending to be Protestants, but building obelisks and all this crazy symbolism embedded into the streets of Washington, D.C., I mean, you have the whole Kabbalistic tree of life in D.C., and so this goes way back, before the founding of America, this sort of infiltration of Mystery Babylon into the Western world, into the Christian world. It was already embedded in Roman Catholicism. I mean, because all this stuff, the Knights Templar and the Jesuits, they're all into this stuff too. I tell you, like, there's this whole movement now of people trying to kind of pin it all, like, oh, it's these Protestants that are all into the Kabbalah, and they've all been seduced by Jewish, Zionism and Jewish magic. But it's like, this is why I love kind of talking about it on just the level of scientism, because it has literally, once you kind of see it as being that broad, it has literally seduced and blinded the whole world, like all the religions, right? They all want to harmonize themselves with science. Nobody wants to question all this stuff. We all believe in the atomic genie. That's just science, man. That's not religion. It's just everything's made out of little solar systems, little clouds of potentiality, right? This is a cult philosophy at the end of the day. This is changing the way you see the whole construct of reality in a way that completely ignores the revelation that we have from the Creator.